June 12, 1944. The outskirts of Corentin, Normandy. A German sniper named Georg Bauer lay motionless in the upper floor of a stone farmhouse, eye pressed against the scope of his Karabiner 98K, watching a column of American infantry move along a sunken road 300 yards to his left. He had been in position since before dawn. He had not eaten. He had barely breathed. The Americans were moving slowly, spread out, rifles at the low ready, helmets catching the flat morning light in brief silver flashes. He had a clear line of sight to the lead man. The wind was negligible. The range was well within what he had done 100 times before. Georg Bauer did not fire. He lay there for 22 minutes while the Americans passed completely through his field of view, disappeared around a bend in the sunken road, and continued south toward Corentin. And then he exhaled slowly, pulled back from the window, sat against the wall below the sill, and stared at the ceiling of the farmhouse for a long time without moving. This is a story about the most feared individual soldier on any battlefield of the Second World War. A man trained to operate alone, to remain invisible, to kill with a single round from distances that made identification impossible and retaliation seem futile. The German sniper of the Wehrmacht was not a common soldier who had been handed a rifle with a scope. He was a specialist, selected through a rigorous process, trained at dedicated schools, equipped with purpose-built weapons, and sent into combat with a singular mandate: find the most valuable target visible, wait as long as necessary, and kill him with one round. For the first years of the war, this mandate had worked with devastating effect. On the Eastern Front, German snipers had become a source of paralytic terror for Soviet infantry. Officers refused to stand upright. Radiomen were shot at distances that made the crack of the rifle arrive seconds after the bullet. Soldiers learned to move in crouches, to never look over the same piece of cover twice, to never light a cigarette in the open, to never help a wounded man until darkness fell because the sniper who had shot the wounded man was still watching the body, waiting for the next target to appear. The name of that tactic, shooting the rescuer, had a specific German term that experienced snipers taught to their students at the sniper school at Zossen. It was one of the first advanced techniques a German sniper learned. By the summer of 1944, when the 1st American divisions broke out of the Normandy beachhead and pushed south into the hedgerow country of the Bocage, German snipers were available in numbers that the Wehrmacht's high command believed would bleed the Americans the same way Soviet infantry had been bled. They were wrong. And the story of why they were wrong is not a story about a single weapon, a single tactic, or a single act of individual courage. It is a story about a system that the United States Army had built, layer by layer, over a period of years, that transformed the most lethal individual weapon on the battlefield into a problem that solved itself. Not by making the sniper harder to hide, not by making American soldiers harder to hit, by making the act of firing the rifle more dangerous to the man behind the scope than the men in front of it. To understand what Georg Bauer understood in that farmhouse outside Corentin when he chose not to fire, you have to understand two armies that had thought about the sniper problem from completely opposite directions. The German army's approach to snipers was built on a philosophy of concealment and patience. A trained Wehrmacht sniper was taught above everything else to control his shot count. The doctrine, written into the sniper training manuals used at the schools in Zossen and at the later schools established in occupied territories as the war expanded, was explicit on this point. A sniper who fires more than 2 rounds from a single position has made an error. The position is compromised. The sniper who fires once and moves is a ghost. The sniper who fires twice and moves is still invisible. The sniper who fires 3 times from the same window is a dead man. This restraint was not caution. It was an operational philosophy. The German sniper existed to kill specific targets, to create specific effects, and then to disappear before those effects could be answered. The system worked because for the first years of the war, the armies the Germans were shooting at could not answer fast enough. Soviet counter-sniper operations in 1941 and 1942 were reactive and slow. A Soviet soldier who was shot from a building took the rest of his company with him to the ground, and by the time anyone had organized a response, the German sniper was 6 blocks away in a new position. The British in North Africa were methodical but sequential, working through a deliberate process of identification, reporting up the chain, waiting for authorization, assembling a response. The gap between the shot and the counter was measured in hours. In hours, a German sniper could move to 4 new positions, eat a meal, and sleep for 20 minutes. The American approach was different. And the difference was not immediately visible in any single piece of equipment or any single tactical decision. The difference was in how American infantry had been trained to react to the sound of a sniper's round before anyone knew where the round had come from. At Fort Benning, Georgia, and at the various infantry training camps established across the United States after Pearl Harbor, American soldiers were taught a response to sniper fire that no other army in the war had formalized at the individual level. The response was not taking cover. The response was not to wait for orders. The response was immediate, distributed, aimed fire at the most probable source of the round, executed simultaneously by every man who could bring a weapon to bear, within the first 3 seconds of hearing the shot. 3 seconds. Not 3 minutes. Not 30 seconds. 3 seconds. This was not a natural reaction. A man who has just heard a supersonic round crack past his ear does not naturally begin to aim fire at a partially obscured window 200 yards away. The natural reaction is to press into the earth and stay there. The American training system spent months systematically replacing that natural reaction with a trained one. Soldiers were exposed repeatedly to the sound of fire from concealed positions. They were drilled on immediate response. They were evaluated not on whether they took cover correctly but on whether they returned fire immediately and aimed it toward the correct sector. And then the army gave them a rifle that made that training lethal in a way that the rifles of every other army could not. The M1 Garand was a semi-automatic rifle. This detail, which appears in every history of the Second World War and is usually treated as a footnote about firepower, was in the context of the sniper problem something far more consequential than it appears. A German sniper who had just fired a round and was beginning to shift position or settle into stillness for a second shot faced, if his target was an American, a fundamentally different response than the one his training had prepared him for. He expected bolt-action rifles. He expected the distinctive sound of soldiers working their actions between shots, breaking their sight pictures, losing fractions of a second per round. He expected a rate of return fire that gave him time to breathe between the shot and the response. He instead got the continuous rolling crack of semi-automatic fire from every American soldier in the immediate vicinity who had heard the round, swung toward the source, and was pulling the trigger as fast as aimed fire permitted. 8 rounds from a Garand in the time it took a German rifleman with a Kar 98K to fire 2. Multiply that by the 8 or 9 men in a standard American rifle squad who were not the sniper's target and who were now all firing at the window, the tree line, the hedgerow, or the roofline from which the shot had come. The German sniper's first round had just summoned somewhere between 40 and 70 rounds of semi-automatic fire onto his position within seconds of his trigger pull. And he had not yet decided whether to fire a second shot. But this was only the first layer of a problem that Georg Bauer and the snipers of his generation had not been trained to survive. Because behind those 40 to 70 immediate rounds was something else. Something that did not make any sound until it was already falling from above. And to understand that second layer, you need to go back to the hills of Italy in the autumn of 1943, where a German sniper named Sepp Allerberger, one of the most decorated snipers in the Wehrmacht's history, did exactly what his training had prepared him to do, and spent the next 48 hours understanding that the training had not prepared him for the war he was now fighting. October 1943, the Gustav Line, Italy. Sepp Allerberger was 20 years old when he received his first sniper rifle, a Kar 98K fitted with a 4-power scope, after demonstrating a talent for accuracy that his platoon commander had noticed during a firefight near the Volturno River. Allerberger was not a product of the formal sniper school at the time. He was a self-taught opportunist who had grown up hunting in the Austrian mountains and who had the particular kind of patience that separates a man who is merely accurate from a man who is lethal at long range. He was given the rifle, given minimal additional instruction, and sent back to his unit with the expectation that he would figure out the rest. He did figure out the rest. By the time the Wehrmacht was digging into the defensive positions of the Gustav Line south of Rome, Allerberger had refined a set of operational habits that the formal sniper schools would have recognized and approved. He worked alone or with a single spotter. He selected positions with multiple exit routes before he selected his firing point. He never fired more than 2 rounds from any single location. He never used the same position twice in the same week. He moved between shots by crawling, regardless of whether crawling was necessary, because the discipline of crawling rather than walking between positions had kept him alive when a faster man would have stood up and died. These habits had worked against the British and against the Italians in the earlier phases of the campaign. Against the Americans on the Volturno and then in the approaches to the Gustav Line. He noticed something he could not fully articulate at first, but that he would spend the rest of the campaign trying to understand. The Americans answered differently. Not just faster, though they were faster. They answered in a way that suggested they had been expecting the shot. Not expecting it in the sense of knowing it was coming, but expecting it in the sense that the response was already organized before the echo of his round had finished rolling across the valley. The rifles came up simultaneously. The fire came from multiple positions at once. And within seconds of that simultaneous fire, he would hear a sound that had become the most reliable indicator of how the next few minutes of his life were going to develop. The sound of a 60mm mortar being loaded. The American 60mm mortar was not a precision weapon. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be portable, simple, fast, and capable of putting a high explosive round onto a target within 30 seconds of the crew receiving a direction to fire. Every American rifle company had a mortar section. Every mortar section had been trained on one specific drill that Allerberger had encountered enough times to recognize as doctrine rather than improvisation. The instant a sniper round was fired and the general direction of the source identified by the rifleman who returned fire, the mortar section loaded a round, angled toward the identified sector, and dropped it. Not necessarily on the exact position. Close enough to force the sniper to move. And the sniper who moved under mortar fire moved faster than a sniper who was moving on his own initiative. A sniper moving fast made mistakes. A sniper making mistakes left traces. A sniper who left traces in the Italian terrain, where American forward observers with binoculars were watching every piece of ground that might conceal a German position, had now become something that his training had not prepared him to be. A target for artillery. This is the layer of the problem that had no answer in the German sniper school curriculum. Not the immediate rifle response, uncomfortable but manageable for a man who moved quickly. Not the mortar, dangerous but predictable for a man who had chosen his exit routes carefully. The artillery. The American system for converting a sniper's location into an artillery strike was not the system of other armies. Other armies in 1943 required a forward observer to see the target, request fire through a chain of officers, wait for approval, wait for the battery to compute data, and wait for the rounds to fly. This process in the British and Soviet systems took between 10 and 20 minutes on a good day. On a bad day it took longer. On the day when the approval was denied because the ammunition allocation had been exhausted, it did not happen at all. The American system required none of those steps. Every American infantry company had attached to it a forward observer from the field artillery. A trained officer who walked with the rifleman, carried a radio, and had a direct line to the fire direction center. He did not request permission to fire. He identified the target, read the coordinates, and the fire direction center computed the data for every available battery simultaneously and transmitted firing solutions to the guns. From the moment a forward observer called a target, the first rounds were in the air within 3 minutes. 3 minutes from a sniper's trigger pull to artillery impact on his position. 3 minutes from the muzzle flash that the forward observer's binoculars had caught against the stone wall of a farmhouse or the dark gap in a hedgerow. Allerberger survived the Italian campaign. He survived it by developing an instinct for the sound of American radio traffic, which he claimed he could distinguish from German radio traffic by cadence and frequency even when he could not hear the words. He survived by extending his move interval after each shot to well under 2 minutes, which meant sometimes relocating before he had fully confirmed his round had struck. He survived by selecting positions that had overhead cover, not just lateral concealment, because he had learned that mortar rounds landing near a position without overhead cover produced shrapnel patterns that a man lying flat in a ditch could survive, while the same round landing near a position with overhead cover produced a different and more survivable pressure wave. He survived, in short, by spending more cognitive energy on what happened after the shot than on the shot itself. And he was one of the best snipers the Wehrmacht produced. The snipers who were not among the best began dying in patterns that German battalion commanders were recording in their after-action reports by the end of 1943. Not dying from counter-sniper operations, though those were also becoming more effective. dying from the sequence, the rifle fire, the mortar, the artillery. Dying from the speed of an American response system that treated the sniper's firing position not as a point to be identified and then destroyed through a methodical process, but as a target that could be serviced within the same tactical window in which it had revealed itself. By the time the American army arrived in France in June of 1944, this sequence had been refined through 11 months of combat in North Africa and Italy. The forward observers had become faster. The fire direction centers had become more efficient. The mortar sections had developed immediate reaction drills that shaved seconds off their response time. And the riflemen had been trained and retrained and trained again on the first 3 seconds of response, until the immediate return of aimed fire had become something close to a physiological reflex. The men landing on the beaches of Normandy brought this system with them. But Normandy presented a problem that Italy had not. The bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy, was terrain that had been growing since the medieval period. Fields the size of tennis courts enclosed on all 4 sides by earthen embankments 4 feet thick at the base, topped with trees and root systems so dense that a round fired into the hedgerow buried itself in the earth and traveled no meaningful distance toward whatever was behind it. For an American rifleman trained to return immediate fire toward a sniper's position, the bocage was a training scenario turned inside out. The sniper was behind the hedgerow. The rifleman's round was being absorbed by the hedgerow. The muzzle flash, if there was one visible at all, was a pale flicker through a gap in the vegetation that disappeared before a man could swing his barrel toward it and establish a sight picture. For the forward observer, the bocage was equally disabling. A man lying behind a hedgerow and watching the ground ahead of him could see, at most, the next hedgerow 50 yards away. He could not see the firing position behind it. He could not give accurate coordinates for a position he could not locate. And even when coordinates were accurate, high explosive rounds detonating against the tops of the hedgerows showered the defenders at the base with dirt and branches rather than steel. The earthen walls were absorbing American artillery the way soil absorbs rain, completely and without visible effect. German snipers who had been increasingly cautious about their firing positions in the open terrain of the Italian mountains found in the bocage something they had not had since the early campaigns in the East. Invulnerability. Not absolute invulnerability, but the functional kind, the kind that emerges when the terrain removes the most dangerous elements of the enemy's response system. The rifle fire was still coming through the hedgerow gap, but without a clear target. The mortars were still landing, but without precise direction. The artillery was still being called, but the forward observer could not see the sniper's position and the rounds were landing on the tops of earthen walls that laughed at high explosive. German battalion commanders in the 3rd week of June were writing interrogation reports with a confidence that had been absent since North Africa. A sniper dug into the base of a hedgerow with a gap cut at ground level was, in their assessment, effectively immune to the American counter-sniper system that had been making their snipers cautious in Italy. They were correct. For approximately 3 weeks, they were entirely correct. But they were making the same error that every commander who fought against the Americans eventually made. They were assuming that the problem would remain static. They were assuming that the army which could not solve the bocage problem in June would still be unable to solve it in July. This assumption failed to account for the most dangerous element of the American military machine, which was not the M1 Garand, was not the forward observer, was not the artillery. It was the speed at which the American army learned from its own failures and distributed what it had learned to every unit on the front. There was a room at 1st Army headquarters, and later equivalent rooms at corps and division level, that had no counterpart in any other army in the war. It was staffed by officers whose assignment was not to plan operations or coordinate logistics or manage personnel. Their assignment was to read after-action reports filed by company and battalion commanders within hours of an engagement, extract tactical lessons from those reports, and distribute those lessons to every unit in the theater before the tactical situation that had generated them had time to change. These men did not wait for the information to travel up the chain of command and come back down through the standard distribution process. They wrote summaries in plain language, mimeographed them, and delivered them laterally across the army at a speed that had no precedent in the history of military communication. A company commander of the 29th Infantry Division who had figured out that a sniper concealed in the base of a hedgerow could be located by suppressing the gap with a Browning automatic rifle, while a second soldier threw a smoke grenade to the left of the gap and a third moved through the adjacent hedgerow to close from an angle the sniper could not cover, wrote this observation in his after-action report before he slept on the night he had used it. By the following morning, the report was at regiment. By the end of that day, it was at 1st Army headquarters. By the end of the week, a mimeographed bulletin describing the technique, with a hand-drawn diagram, was in the hands of every rifle platoon leader in the Corps. 5 days from a single company's discovery to army-wide adoption, German snipers operating in the bocage in the last week of June had encountered one version of the American counter-sniper response. German snipers operating in the first week of July encountered a different version, incorporating the lessons of the previous week. German snipers operating in the third week of July encountered a version of the response that had been refined through 4 separate iterations in 30 days and that bore almost no resemblance to what the sniper school at Zossen had taught them to expect. A German sniper named Matthias Hetzenauer, who would finish the war as one of the Wehrmacht's highest credited snipers, later described in debriefings conducted after his capture in 1945 that the experience of operating against American infantry in France was categorically different from his experience against Soviet infantry in the East. Against the Soviets, he said, a sniper could take a shot and rely on the chaos of the response to provide cover for his movement. The Soviets were brave and numerous and willing to advance into fire, but the coordination of their response was slow enough that a patient man in a good position could sometimes fire twice and still relocate safely. Against the Americans, he said, the response was immediate, coordinated, and escalating in a way that made the time available for relocation after a shot shorter with every week that passed. He said he began to feel, somewhere in the bocage, that the Americans were learning faster than he was adapting. He was correct. And the adaptation that was about to make the bocage irrelevant to the sniper equation was being assembled in a farmyard 30 kilometers behind the German line by a cavalry sergeant from New Jersey who was staring at a pile of German beach obstacles and seeing something no one else had seen yet. Curtis Kulin was 29 years old and not a man who had been trained as an engineer or weapons designer or a tactician. He was a cavalryman who had been handed an infantry problem and who was looking at it without the professional assumptions that might have told him the problem was unsolvable. The problem was simple to state. A Sherman tank attempting to cross a hedgerow had to climb the earthen embankment, which tilted the tank's belly skyward, exposing the thinnest armor on the vehicle to any German soldier with a Panzerfaust within range. Every Sherman that had tried to cross a hedgerow in the first weeks of the bocage fighting had either been destroyed in that moment of exposure or had backed away from the wall and been routed around, which channeled it onto roads where anti-tank guns were waiting. Kulin took a cutting torch to 2 of the steel hedgehog obstacles that the Germans had welded together and buried in the Normandy sand to gut landing craft, cut 4 prongs from the scrap, welded them to a crossbar, and welded the crossbar to the front hull of a Sherman. The device weighed approximately 100 pounds and looked like the jaw of a prehistoric animal. He pointed the tank at a hedgerow and told the driver to hit it at 10 miles an hour. The prongs bit into the base of the embankment, pinned the tank's nose down so the belly never lifted, and the Sherman pushed straight through the wall of earth and vegetation and emerged on the far side with its gun level, its armor facing forward, and its crew already scanning for targets. General Omar Bradley saw the demonstration and ordered every available Sherman in 1st Army to be fitted with the device immediately. Ordnance crews worked around the clock cutting up the beach obstacles from Omaha and Utah. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 3 out of every 5 tanks in 1st Army had the Kulin device, which the soldiers called a Rhino, welded to their hulls. The Rhino did not destroy the sniper's position. The Rhino destroyed the terrain that had been protecting the sniper's position. A Sherman fitted with a Rhino could crash through a hedgerow at any point along its length, emerging on the other side with its gun traversing and its crew ready. The sniper who had dug himself into the base of that hedgerow was no longer behind cover. He was inside a killing box that had a tank on one side and American infantry coming through the gap the tank had made on the other side. And now the sequence that had been disrupted by the bocage terrain was running again. The immediate rifle fire from the infantry moving through the gap. The mortar dropped smoke on the adjacent hedgerow to prevent the sniper from repositioning under cover. The forward observer walking with the infantry, radio in hand, ready to call the fire direction center the moment any position revealed itself in a way that could be located on a grid. 3 minutes from trigger pulled to artillery impact. 3 minutes in terrain that could no longer absorb the artillery because the artillery was now landing on the sniper's position directly rather than on the top of an earthen wall. July 26, 1944. A field east of Marigny during the second day of Operation Cobra. A German sniper had been in position at the base of a hedgerow on the southern edge of a small field since before first light. He had a firing gap cut at ground level, screened with vegetation. He had a prepared alternate position 12 meters to his left connected by a shallow crawled trench he had dug himself over the previous 2 nights. He had memorized the distances to reference points across the field. He was as well prepared as his training and his experience could make him. At 7:40 in the morning, the hedgerow on the northern edge of the field shook. Dirt erupted outward in both directions. 33 tons of steel broke through the embankment and entered the field with a 75mm gun already traversing south. The sniper had a choice that was no longer a choice. If he fired on the infantry following the tank through the gap, he would reveal his position to the Sherman's gunner, who was already watching the base of the southern hedgerow through his sight. If he fired on the tank, his 7.92mm round would accomplish nothing. If he stayed silent and motionless, the infantry would sweep the hedgerow with grenades and Browning automatic rifle fire within 90 seconds of clearing the gap. He fired, not because the calculation favored it, but because training and the accumulated habit of the previous year told him that this was the moment for which he had been prepared. And the body executes what the training has built even when the mind can see that the conditions have changed. The Sherman's gunner saw the muzzle flash at the base of the southern hedgerow at a range of approximately 110 yards. He had been watching for exactly that. The turret traversed. A 75mm high explosive round hit the embankment 3 feet above the sniper's firing gap. The concussion alone would have been sufficient. The shrapnel was not necessary. It was there anyway. What happened in that field east of Marigny on July 26 was not unique. It was repeated across the Norman countryside through the last week of July in a pattern that German battalion and regimental commanders were recording in their logs with a consistency that had moved beyond tactical observation and into something closer to despair. The snipers who had survived the bocage by using the terrain as their primary protection were losing the terrain. And without the terrain, they were left with only their training and their instincts against a system that had been specifically built, layer by layer, to turn those instincts against them. A captured German sniper from the 352nd Infantry Division, interrogated at a 1st Army Prisoner Processing Center in late July, described his experience in the bocage and then in the open terrain fighting that followed Cobra in terms that the interrogating officer recorded verbatim in his report. The sniper said that in the bocage he had felt, for the first time since the Eastern Front, that his position was defensible. He said the hedgerows had given him back something that had been taken from him in Italy, the feeling that he could fire and then have time to think about what to do next. He said that when the tanks came through the hedgerows, that feeling ended. He said that after the tanks, there was no time to think. There was only the movement, and the movement was never fast enough, and the American artillery arrived before the movement was complete. He said he had watched 3 snipers in his battalion die within seconds of firing their first round, not from counter-sniper fire, not from a trained American marksman who had located them, but from the immediate response of the infantry around the target, followed by the mortar, followed by artillery so fast that it seemed to him impossible that anyone could have computed the data and transmitted the fire mission in the time available. He did not know about the fire direction center. He did not know about the forward observer walking 30 meters behind the first American rifleman who had heard his shot and returned fire. He did not know about the system that turned his muzzle flash into a grid coordinate and that grid coordinate into a fire mission within 90 seconds. He only knew the result. And the result was that in his battalion, by the end of July, the snipers were not being killed by American snipers. They were being killed by American artillery, called within minutes of a shot, landing on positions that should have been impossible to locate that quickly. He said that the younger snipers in his unit had begun to ask their NCOs a question that would have been unthinkable 12 months earlier. A question that the NCOs answered honestly because the honest answer was also the only useful answer. The question was whether it was possible to do the job without firing. Whether there was a way to maintain a position, observe the Americans, and contribute to the defense without pulling the trigger. The NCOs told them there was not. The job required the shot. The shot required the position. The position, once revealed by the shot, was no longer survivable. That was the equation. There was no version of it that came out differently. By August of 1944, German battalion commanders in Normandy were reporting something in their after-action logs that had no precedent in any previous campaign. Snipers were abandoning positions with clear fields of fire, leaving behind loaded rifles, unfired, with Americans in the open at range. Not because of equipment failure. Not because they had been discovered before firing. Because they had made the calculation that the job could not be done and survived, and they had chosen survival. The Wehrmacht's high command had no doctrinal response to this because the doctrine had been written for a battlefield that no longer existed. The doctrine assumed that the threat to the sniper was the counter-sniper, and the counter-sniper could be evaded by the techniques the school at Zossen had been teaching since 1940. The doctrine had not been written for a battlefield where the threat to the sniper was a networked system of immediately responding infantry, organic mortars, and battalion artillery linked by radio to a forward observer who was walking with the people being shot at. The doctrine had not been written for a battlefield where the terrain that once protected the sniper could be removed in seconds by a tank with 4 steel prongs welded to its hull. The doctrine had not been written for a battlefield where the lessons a single company learned about counter-sniper tactics on a Tuesday were in the hands of every rifle platoon in the army by Sunday. Sepp Allerberger survived the Italian campaign and was transferred to the Eastern Front, where the response system he had encountered in Italy was not fully present. Matthias Hetzenauer was captured by the Soviets in 1945 and spent years as a prisoner of war before returning to Austria. Bruno Sutkus, a Lithuanian-born sniper credited with the highest confirmed kill count of any Wehrmacht sniper in the European theater, operated almost exclusively on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces and never encountered the full weight of the American counter-sniper system. The snipers who did encounter it, the men who were sent to Normandy in June of 1944 and who survived long enough to understand what they were facing, began making the calculation that Georg Bauer made in the farmhouse outside Corentin on the morning of June 12. The calculation was not complicated. It required only that a man be honest with himself about what the shot would cost him. The cost had changed. In 1941 on the Eastern Front, the cost of a shot was the expenditure of a round and the risk of a counter-sniper response that might locate him within minutes if he was careless and within hours if he was not. In Normandy in the summer of 1944, the cost of a shot was the activation of a system that would deliver immediate semi-automatic fire from every American within earshot, followed by mortar fire within 30 seconds, followed by artillery within 3 minutes, all of it guided by a network of observers and communication infrastructure that had no equivalent on the German side of the line. The shot that had once been the sniper's primary tool had become, in the specific tactical environment the American army had built, the sniper's primary vulnerability. The most dangerous thing a German sniper could do in the bocage in the summer of 1944 was the thing he had been trained to do. And Georg Bauer understood that in the farmhouse outside Corentin, lying above a loaded rifle pointed at a column of Americans 300 yards away, the most dangerous moment of his war was not the moment the Americans might find him. It was the moment he might find them. He did not fire. He left the farmhouse before first light the following morning, before the Rhino tanks of the 29th Infantry Division came through the hedgerow on the northern edge of the adjacent field and began the methodical clearance that would reach his position by mid-afternoon. He left the rifle behind. It was found by soldiers of the 115th Infantry Regiment and noted in their records as an abandoned sniper position, weapon present, unfired, position apparently vacated voluntarily. The entry is 3 lines in a regimental log that has been in the National Archives since 1947. Georg Bauer does not appear in any other American record. He does not appear in any Wehrmacht record that has been identified. What is known about him comes entirely from those 3 lines and from the pattern they represent. A pattern repeated in dozens of similar entries across the regimental and battalion logs of American units operating in Normandy in the summer of 1944. Loaded rifles. Prepared positions. No evidence of counter-sniper engagement. No bodies. Just abandonment. The sum of those entries is not a story about cowardice. The men who walked away from those positions were, in many cases, among the most skilled and most experienced individual soldiers in the German army. They had been trained to endure conditions that would have broken most men. They had demonstrated, repeatedly and on multiple fronts, the kind of patience and nerve that the job of a sniper requires. What they were demonstrating in those empty positions with their loaded rifles was not the failure of courage but the success of American doctrine. The successful creation of a battlefield environment in which the sniper's greatest professional asset, the ability to fire a precisely aimed round at a selected target, had been converted from a strength into a liability. The M1 Garand gave every American rifleman the ability to suppress a position within seconds of a shot. The 60mm mortar gave every rifle company the ability to put explosive steel on that position within 30 seconds. The Forward Observer and the Fire Direction Center gave the American infantry the ability to bring battalion artillery onto the position within 3 minutes. The Rhino tank gave the American Army the ability to remove the terrain that had been protecting the position. The Lessons Learned system gave every American unit in the theater access to the tactical innovations that each of those elements had produced, distributed faster than the Germans could adapt to any single iteration of the response. Together, those elements constituted a machine that had been built not to defeat the sniper specifically, but whose existence made the sniper's operational environment progressively untenable with every week of the campaign. The sniper had not changed. The rifles had not changed. The training had not changed. What had changed was the world the sniper was operating in, and the world had changed faster than any individual human being, however skilled, however patient, however well-trained, could adapt to alone. This is the full answer to the question. Not a single invention, not a single engagement, not a single act of individual courage on the American side or individual failure on the German side. A system built in layers over years, assembled from the lessons of 2.5 years of combat on 3 continents, and brought to bear on the Norman countryside in the summer of 1944 with the full weight of the most industrially productive nation in the history of warfare behind it. The German sniper was a craftsman operating in an environment that had been specifically engineered to make his craft lethal to himself. And the men who built that environment were not the men whose names appear in the histories. They were the forward observers who walked 30 meters behind the lead squad in every engagement, the fire direction center sergeants who computed firing solutions in under 2 minutes, the ordnance crews who cut beach obstacles into hedgerow cutters through the nights of early July, the officers in the lessons learned offices who read after-action reports at 1 in the morning and had them mimeographed and distributed before noon the following day. They did not receive decorations for defeating the German sniper. They received their regular pay. The German sniper who did not fire was not a coward. He was a rational man who had been trained by experience to read a battlefield honestly. He had read the battlefield honestly and concluded that the shot he was being asked to take would be the last shot he took. Georg Bauer left his rifle in a farmhouse outside Corentin and disappeared from the historical record. The column of Americans he had watched through his scope continued south toward Corentin and continued the war. The war continued for another 11 months. When it ended, the Wehrmacht's sniper program had been systematically degraded not by counter-sniper operations, not by American marksmen who had outdueled German marksmen in the open, but by the accumulated weight of a system that had made every shot a death sentence and had distributed that knowledge to every American unit on the front faster than any German adaptation could address it. The loaded rifles left in empty positions are the footnotes that the history books skip over. They are 3-line entries in regimental logs that have been sitting in archives for 80 years without anyone asking what they mean in aggregate. In aggregate, they mean that by the summer of 1944, the most dangerous individual weapon on the battlefield had been neutralized, not by a better weapon, not by a better sniper, but by the grinding, layered, institutionally patient will of an army that refused to leave the problem unsolved and that learned, collectively and continuously, faster than any individual opponent could adapt. The rifle had not changed. The war around it had. If this video showed you something about this war you had not seen before, a like is the single best way to help it reach the next person who cares about this history. And there are more of us than the algorithm thinks. Subscribe if you have not and turn on the bell so the next one finds you. I would love to know where you are watching from today and whether anyone in your family served in the Second World War. My grandfather's generation did not talk about what they did. Maybe yours did. Tell me in the comments. Those stories deserve to be heard.